Welcome back. It seems, having covered some of the technical aspects of the machine, kind of rude to not include some information on operation. So here we go. Oh dear, this sun's not helping things, is it? When doing your pre-start checks, it's important to note that these Petter twin-cylinder diesels have a very broad flat sump, and the oil level indicated on the dipstick will vary considerably with even a slight change of angle. The same applies to the hydraulic tank. Hydraulic oil warms and gets little air bubbles in it with use, so you don't want it all the way full. Just fill it to the bottom of the little gauze strainer inside. If you're missing one of those, that's about 10 centimetres or 4 inches down. The gearboxes on these machines are prone to leak oil, particularly if you've got an old one, but they can also fill with rainwater as well, which is another useful feature. These gearboxes have a dipstick on them, so you can check all of that out as you're going around the machine. Fuel. If you're using the Tusker with its digger arm on, the fuel consumption will be much more than when it's being used as a dumper, so it pays to brim the tank every day before you start work. A lot of people are scared of starting handles. There's all sorts of stories about people breaking wrists, but this is a diesel engine with a big heavy flywheel. It's not a petrol engine that'll kick back and do horrible things to you. The correct way of holding the starting handle is like this, so if anything does happen, your thumb doesn't get broken off. You'll quickly learn before shutting the engine down on your Tusker to check where the rear wheels are. In normal circumstances, you can just steer the machine to get yourself out of this trouble. However, if you've left the machine with the legs down, there'll be so much weight on the back wheels that you won't be able to steer straight. And with no hydraulics working, you're gonna have a job raising those legs. Your only way out of this now is to use a jack, either to lift the rear of the machine to get the weight off the rear wheels, or to take the weight off the legs at the front so you can lower them to get the weight off the rear wheels so you can steer. There is another way if you're feeling brave and your engine's in really good nick. Full throttle. And lift a cold start. With the engine on compression, feel the way, and we've landed there straight away. We've got a good swing. That's compression there on one of the cylinders. It's just bouncing back off the other one. I believe it was Max Zorin who said more power. Despite Thwaites' best efforts, the Tusker digger is still a nose-heavy tail-light machine. Turning circle on these is under 20 feet, and that's achieved in around 2.5 turns lock to lock on the steering wheel, so the slightest bit of inattention and you'll be heading in a vastly different direction to the one you were heading 1 second earlier. Brakes, if the brakes aren't absolutely spot on with even adjustment, you'll find that braking makes you change direction, which can get pretty interesting. And the steering, again, really needs to be quite good. I replaced all of the ball joints on my machine, plus some bushings and some other bits and pieces to get it good. Travelling position when you're moving the machine around is not with the arms straight ahead as everybody thinks, but as alluded to in the Tusker sales literature, by virtue of the 7'7" width, with the arm crow to one side, You've got the choice of swinging it to the left-hand side, handy for hitting telegraph poles and taking out parked cars, or having the arm swung round to the right where it completely obscures your forward vision. You choose. Obviously, if you were to burst a hydraulic hose whilst travelling, particularly on the road like this, it's not entirely going to end well. And here in the UK, it's a part of traffic legislation that the arm on any mechanically propelled excavator must be secured against this kind of risk. What I do is put a lorry strap round the back of this ram at the bottom, across to this leg, tighten it up nice and tight, and it'll stop that arm dropping over and hitting somebody and spoiling their day. In terms of moving the machine around, you'll very quickly learn all of its foibles. Loads of weight on the front, overhanging, front wheel drive with only brakes on the front wheels, and rear steer. If you start throwing it into corners, it's really not going to forgive you for that. If you start braking hard, you'll find the rear wheels go in the air in best case scenario. Worst case, if your brakes are unevenly adjusted or you're on too irregular surfaces, you'll spin the machine around. Talking of inclines, and I mean steeper than those you typically find on the road, these are off-site now, treat the machine as a forklift. So you drive forwards up hills, but reverse down inclines. That means the front of the machine isn't teetering over the edge as you're going down an incline, because it will lift the rear wheels, and then you can't steer. I do take this machine on the road, but only when I have to, and only at quiet times of day. I choose a period of time when the traffic is quiet. You just would not believe the stupid stunts people do to get past you. They can't see that waiting 10 seconds until they reach that turn-off is worthwhile. They'll do the most dangerous overtakes, or claim that they didn't see you. In terms of fuel, it is a myth that you can use red diesel on the road. You need to speak to HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue Customs. If you do use red diesel, you have to declare it and you have to pay the equivalent amount of tax back, and it's a whole load of hassle. And to be honest, a lot of red diesel now contains nasty bio content that turns to water if you leave it too long, like I leave this machine over winter. And for what it's worth and for what it burns, I just put white diesel in. There's no questions asked. It starts really easily, as you've seen, burns relatively cleanly, and I haven't got anything to worry about. In terms of manoeuvring the machine on site, hopefully you may have seen some of my other Tusker videos about overcoming obstacles on site. With these machines, you really need to apply a bit more thought as to how you're going to approach a situation. 360-degree excavators are great and allow you to just go in and get the job done. With these, you really have to think a little bit more. Think of the dynamics of the machine and how you're going to overcome problems. There's all sorts of dodges you can do if you're prepared to give it thought, to allow you to get jobs done that on first glance you might think a 180-degree machine can't do. I think that kind of covers moving the machine around, which leaves the digging aspect. This may take some time. Many people who come to own a Tusker or operate one are quite likely to be more used to a modern 360-degree mini digger, and there's a lot of differences between one of those and one of these. I never really understood some of those differences until quite recently. You hear a lot of the old guys talking about these 4-stick machines, and I just thought, well, you know, it's all the same. You've just got 4 sticks instead of a pair of joysticks, but there's quite a bit more to it than that. Do excuse this sunlight. I thought it'd be a good time of day to film. The hydraulics on the Tusker, in common with many older 360-degree excavators, work on a completely different principle to the hydraulics on a more modern machine. The Tusker uses a fixed output gear pump. By fixed output, what it means is that it delivers the same amount of fluid per revolution, regardless of load. Obviously, as you speed the pump up, it will deliver more, but it's per revolution is the delivery. And no matter what you're doing, that pump will deliver fluid. It will move oil around the system. The oil comes from the hydraulic oil pump into the spool valve, does a circuit around the valve, and then returns along this pipe back to our return filter from where it goes into the tank. So this pump is pumping fluid all of the time. What about when you're just running the engine and not pulling any of the levers? What's happening to the oil? Well, it is doing exactly that. It's returning. Oil, like water, takes the path of least resistance. How do these valves do anything? You've got tremendous resistance in those hydraulic rams. The valves are actually, when you operate these spool levers, are restricting the return of the oil. They're shutting off the easy route and instead forcing the oil to take a more difficult path through the rams. These valves aren't like taps in your kitchen when by moving them you're opening the tap. The thing that makes it happen is that you're shutting off another tap, which is the return path of the oil to the hydraulic tank. By contrast, modern 360-degree excavators, they use a variable output pump which is capable of delivering no oil or lots of oil and anything in between, and the valves are plumbed the other way. So when you start the machine and you're idling, the pump's not delivering any fluid. It's built up pressure and that's it. It will only deliver fluid when you make a demand by operating the valves, and then it's opening the tap. Therefore, the newer machines aren't operating on this restrictive principle of making it move by shutting off the easy path. They're working more like taps in your kitchen. By opening a valve, you are allowing fluid to move to the cylinders rather than forcing it. Therefore, the earlier statement of oil following the path of least resistance doesn't quite apply quite the same. This is shown in the way that the arm handles, and it's markedly different from on a modern 360-degree excavator with a variable output pump. This is the bucket lever here, and here's the boom lever. So we're going to move the bucket lever and the boom lever together. Initially, only the bucket will move, because that is the path of least resistance. As soon as the bucket reaches the end of the ram, boom, up comes the boom. On many modern 360-degree excavators with their more modern hydraulic systems, that wouldn't happen. The two controls would be more inclined to work together. Just to make things even more of a brain bender on this Tusker, what was making the boom so reluctant to raise? It's weight, that old gravity thing again. So having shown you that, we'll do the reverse. We'll move both of the levers forward together. The same, or indeed the reverse, does not happen, because this time you've got gravity on the side. The same characteristics with differential movement of the various hydraulic services can be found in other combinations of these levers, and they will vary according to the load state upon those rams, so if you're raising or lowering, or digging versus returning the bucket. It's useful to understand why this is happening, but probably not useful to think about it too much, because you'll just end up massively overloading your brain and confusing yourself. Once you've started to get the feel of the machine, after many attempts, and as I found importantly, many breaks, it all starts to become slightly more intuitive. One thing I would say about this machine is they do take a lot of getting used to, and if ever you feel the job's not going quite right, or maybe you're getting a little mentally tired, seriously stop the engine, get off the machine and have a cup of tea, and you'll come back refreshed and with a better mindset, and into the bargain you may not have got yourself into a terrible situation or even damaged the machine. You'll have seen in my other videos that the mechanical legs are raised and lowered by using the bucket to push down on the ground. When this happens, a large amount of weight is transferred to the rear of the machine, and it is the rear axle which is free to pivot. There's quite a lot of articulation on the rear axle. So as you push the bucket down onto the ground in order to lift the front of the machine to drop your legs, the weight of the machine is all resting on that little balance point in the middle, on that axle pivot. Now, if you've seen part one, you'll remember that the engine is offset. Luckily, most operators weigh less than a PETA PH2, they're quite a lump. And what this means is that when you put the machine onto this balance point, the tendency of the machine will be that it will pivot to the left. 9 times out of 10 it'll do that. At first it seems alarming, but as it pivots to the left, wrong way, you will eventually reach that axle limit stop. Thwaites were clearly on the case when they came up with this design, because the hydraulic suction filter inside the tank is located on the same side of the engine, so as the machine tilts to the left, the oil all gathers around the filter. If you do find yourself tilting to the right, it's likely that if you are on an extreme angle, you'll hear a funny little kind of buzzing noise from the hydraulic pump, and the controls are less responsive. That means that you are running out of hydraulic oil because it's all on the right hand side of the tank. It's a very broad and flat tank. This is not really the best design. Good hydraulic tanks are kind of tall and narrow, but it is what it is. If you notice during operation on an angle that the controls are getting sluggish, you've got very little time to do something about it before you knacker the hydraulic pump. Your action might be to stop the engine and have a think about it, or maybe reverse the movements that you've just done. You'll have noticed that I've got the wide grading bucket on this machine today, and unfortunately for this, that bucket provides great stability when moving the machine around using the arm. However, if you're using the narrow buckets, you'll find they're much more likely to have the machine pivoting around on its rear axle. I'll just do a few movements which hopefully will kind of demonstrate what's going on. Here I have a narrow bucket simulator, which is a block of wood. So I'm going to put the bucket on there, attempt to raise the front of the machine. It'll probably go, and I expect that it'll slip off to one side, but I'm going to go with that and allow the rear axle to hit that limit stop, and then we'll continue to go up. We're on the stop. The same applies when the machine is on slew. You can see I've filled the bucket with a large number of rocks, and we'll do the same trick again. You'll see the axle travelling over onto its limit stop, then reaching that stop and the machine behaving accordingly. Whilst the bucket's still full of rocks, I may as well show you another Tusker dodge. It's what I call the ditch crossing. Once you've got the back wheels over, you can use the arm on the front to lift the front wheels over the same obstacle. There's a little bit in the Tusker operator's handbook about raising and lowering the legs. Lowering them is pretty easy, but some people have difficulty raising them. I'll just give you a quick demo of that now. So we just finished digging and we want to raise the legs. So clearly you're going to push down with the bucket to take the weight off the pins. And that's as far up as the legs are going to come under the machine's own weight. However, the legs aren't coming up by hand because they're still embedded in the ground. So you use the arm to give a secondary lift of the legs, just to pull them clear of the soil, and then they come up easily. If you're digging a ditch or some kind of long trench or maybe some footings, it's much easier to move the machine around using the arm than it is to be constantly raising and lowering the legs and swapping seats. Again, referring back to the steering lock, which I mentioned in one of the earlier parts, that helps massively. A bit more about hydraulics before we start moving. Sorry. If you look at the spool valve block, you'll notice that not all is the same. This end segment here is the main incomer, and that has a main pressure relief valve set at something absolutely sky high. This one here is the dipper. We've got the slough with its small little pipes mentioned earlier, and the boom, and then the bucket. And you'll notice that these two have got nuts on them, whereas the others haven't. These are pressure relief valves. So these two are protected by overpressure valves. These two are not. But it's important to note that the dipper does have a pressure relief valve. This is to protect the machine. That protection is afforded by the valve delivering no more fluid once it reaches a certain pressure to the dipper ram, or more importantly, if the dipper ram is subjected to extreme loads by the leverage action of other rams, that valve will lift, and even though you're not touching the dipper valve, you'll see that ram move. It is to save the rest of the machine from tearing itself apart. However, if you operate the machine routinely on full extent of the ram, you get no protection from that safety valve. Whether the rod is fully extended or retracted, you will have a mechanical lock in that the piston inside the ram will be rammed against one end or the other, and the protection afforded by the safety relief valve is lost, and it is at that point that people start ripping bushes out of arms and bending things. Really important to bear this in mind when moving the machine around, because you can subject it to a lot of load. So when you're moving the machine, or in fact doing any operation, try to avoid using any of the rams, apart from the sloughs, which you'll have to, at their extreme ends of travel, because you lose the hydraulic protection. When travelling backwards, it's important to note that the same applies with the ram, and you want to get the legs down on the ground before you run out of travel. So that's actually quite the same as going forwards, eh? When you first start digging, assuming it's on a kind of level surface, you'll notice these are not only in a straight line but horizontal. The tendency will be of the machine to just pull itself forward on its feet. Once you've got down to a depth, however, you see the line of force here is more pulling these spades down into the ground, and it will dig much more powerfully and really rip through the ground without the tendency of the machine to pull forward. When you start your initial dig, you can actually help yourself along by lowering the feet down as far as they'll go, and that seems to help them bed in and get you a better tear out with the bucket. The Tusker operator's manual in the digging instructions makes a reference to placing the machine in exactly this position to start your dig, and pulling back the dipper lever until a distinct hissing sound is heard. That is the sound of the relief valve blowing, at which point the bucket allegedly embeds itself into the ground, and then using the boom lever to raise this, releasing the pressure on the ground, allowing the dipper and the bucket to come forwards towards you. However, what can happen is that you just drag yourself forwards, and after quite a lot of time, one day I found myself trying a different technique, which is to pull both the dipper and boom controls right back, both at the same time, and due to the weight of the boom and the travelling speed of the dipper hydraulic ram, the bucket will scrape the ground quite effectively, and its own weight will normally provide enough penetration of the ground to have filled itself by the time you reach the end of the stroke. Remember the Tusker driving instructions, which are to take a long, thin slice at a time, or as I say, scraping up butter rather than scooping ice cream. Okay, so the ground's a bit harder than usual. Normally it works much better than that. Yeah. Just keep on practicing and give yourself some time to watch professional excavator operators and see what they'll do. You'll notice that they do little tricks that eventually come naturally to you. One day I found myself doing this. It's a little heap of dirt here. Professional excavator operator will dig into the dirt to load their bucket. But if they pull out now, they push the heap further towards them, which is not what they want. So, having filled the bucket, they'll quickly jerk it backwards to fill it, and then lift out with a full scoop without moving the rest of the heap towards them. I hope this has given you some useful tips and insight into operating the Tusker. I don't pretend to be a professional excavator operator. I've not had any real formal training, but I have spent a lot of time speaking to other operators, particularly those who've got experience on the older machines. And I've spent a lot of time watching professional operators and seeing what they do. The best thing you can do really is to get a feel for the machine, but above all, don't rush into it. Often a break will serve you as much of an improvement as just hammering on for grim death. And just take it steady and don't be afraid to stop if you think that anything doesn't quite feel right. I've got myself out of more trouble by stopping than I have by hammering on when maybe you might be starting to see the red mist. Hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe if you're lucky you might have a machine to enjoy as well. See you next time.